Well, welcome to this special edition of Word in Your Ear, which is it's a bit of an inside job, to be honest, because our guest tonight, who's promoting the sixth in his series of fantastically funny, wonderfully knowledgeable, and thumpingly entertaining books about music, is, of course, the magnificent David Hepworth. Dave, welcome. Lovely to see you. Here we are once again online. Are you missing the hurly-burly of the real live promotional literary festival circuit?
Well, normally a launch party would take place in the kind of basement of a bookshop in the West End of London, and everybody would drinking warm white wine and passing around the Twiglers and bitching away in the corner by the detective fiction about how it's not as good as the last one or whatever, all that kind of thing.
That's right.
that people say. So, I don't miss that. But yeah, you kind of I miss going to bookshops, actually, is what I miss, because I had set up absolutely ages ago, months ago, before all this happened, a load of events at places like a lovely little bookshop called the Book Corner in Halifax. And I would have been doing David's in Letchworth, which is a fantastic little bookshop. And probably the Wanstead Tap and all these places. There's a nice little circuit of these places, which is an absolute pleasure to go to. And a pleasure to sell a few books and meet people. And so I'm missing that. But, as for schlepping up and down the country, because frankly, you spend most of your time on the train rather than, talking to people like I'm talking to you here.
So like a 70s rock stars complaining about being in the van the whole time.
Yeah, I suppose.
Not on stage.
Yes. Hotel, plane, literary festival. Hotel, plane, literary festival.
That's right.
Yeah.
But look, it's a brilliant book. And the basic story is about the three main occasions when British music stormed America. And the title, Overpaid, Oversexed and Over There, of course, links directly to the Second World War. And you start the book with the point about the American invasion of Britain. Suddenly 1 million US troops are on the British mainland, and describe, as you do so brilliantly in that first chapter, how that points up the basic differences between the sensibilities and the cultures of the two countries.
Well, it's a million people is a bit of a problem with any kind of import like that, but particularly when it comes in the form of young men with gleaming teeth who are on average over an inch taller than the locals, and have more spending cash to spend on the local women than they do, and have a slightly better uniform and all that kind of thing. And so, that's where you get this particular English-British jealousy of the Americans, that dates back to the war, and that's where the expression comes from: overpaid, oversexed, and over here, which is what they said about the Americans.
Yeah,
and that continues through Hollywood as well. They're all the kind of heroes of entertainment during the in the 40s and the 50s. The big ones were all came from America. And then you get rock and roll as well. And rock and roll, is a form of music. Well, it's like jazz in the sense that it's distinctly American, pretty much like flamenco is distinctly Spanish. So the idea of anybody from a different culture or country attempting to do it seems rather presumptuous, really. So mostly the English didn't really bother, or even when they did, they felt vaguely apologetic about it. So I'm old enough to remember going to see, Elvis Presley in Blue Hawaii in the same year as I saw Cliff Richard in The Young Ones. They're both kind of very colourful. It was similar kind of films, is that Blue Hawaii is obviously a lot more of a travelogue. But, on one side you had Cliff, who for all his glamour still looks as if he came from Cheshunt. and
very Elvis, provincial, with a double-decker bus. That's right.
And Elvis Presley, who looked as if he came from Venus. It's simple as that. He looked like a superhuman creature. He had this superhuman sheen to him. And there was about the Americans an ease that the English, I remember, I'm old enough to kind of remember, even as a young boy, we felt terribly envious of. And we never thought we would ever compete in those kind of stakes. But of course, by the time I was 14, we were starting to compete in them. in a ways that nobody would have predicted a few years earlier. And so that's the first turning point of the book, really.
That's right. And that's the major turning point, because the Beatles kind of arrived on the Ed Sullivan Show in whatever it was, February the 7th, February the 9th, I think it was, 1964.
Yeah.
And obviously there's lots of elements of that package about the way they looked, the way they sounded, the way they acted, or whatever. But what do you think, what were the main things that really appealed to the Americans? What really connected about the Beatles? I think they didn't have before, they thought was original. I
think the first thing you've got to bear in mind is that by the time the Beatles arrived, America was, to use common parlance, gagging for it. You know, they were on side, absolutely, completely on side. They were out there at the airport. The media was private.
Thousands of girls bunked off school.
Absolutely, everybody wanted them to be absolutely huge. You know, for reasons which I go into in the book, because I do think a lot of this to do with the assassination of JFK, which had occurred in late November in 1963. And so there'd been a period of massive national mourning, you know, in which all American teenagers who were around at that time remember just sitting at home looking at each other over that Christmas period. And so when the Beatles arrived in February, there was this massive release of, you know, pent up feelings. And, you know, what the Beatles had to do mainly was just not screw it up. And they didn't screw it up at all, you know, because they had the fabulous records, and they arrived with probably their best early records, I Want to Hold Your Hand and She Loves You, you know, which just had a fantastically infectious air about them. They also just had a natural charm, so that they were
unmanaged, weren't they?
They appeared to be.
It's been busking,
you know, because
in their press conferences.
They came off the plane at JFK, and you put them in a press conference room, and they were on. That was almost as good a good value as them actually performing songs. Yeah, was just them being themselves. But I think the thing that they had, which they didn't realize they had, because it was kind of commonplace in the UK, because, you know, Paul talks about going there and thinking, I don't think the Americans will like us. Surely they've got loads of groups.
They've got enough groups of their own. That's right.
Well, it wasn't true. They didn't have loads of groups of their own. You know, they had loads of solo singers, most of whom were called Bowie and wore, you know, Ivy League sweaters. And then they had lots of instrumental combos, the Ventures, the Safaris, Dick Dale, that kind of thing. But what they didn't have was that strange hybrid, which was the group, which had grown out of skiffle, and it was partly to do with writing your own songs, and it was partly to do, you performed everything yourself. You were a completely self-sufficient unit. And that was the thing that appealed to them. And I think it appealed to them not just musically, it also appealed to them on an emotional level.
Because they were a gang. A group is a gang. You know,
they're a gang.
Because there's no obvious leader either. It's not like Buddy Holly and the Crickets, where it was a group, but you clearly had a leader, you know.
But I think the other thing they were, and this is, I found quite interesting in researching the period, that you know, that generation of fathers of the American baby boomers who'd fought in the war, they'd come back from the war, and they'd moved out of their old extended families in the inner cities, very often in suburban relative luxury, but somewhat isolated from each other. And so there was considerable distance in their families. And so if you read the memoirs of Bruce Springsteen, or you know, read about Tom Petty, read about Chrissie Hynde, there's great distance within the families. And so what the Beatles provided, particularly in the film Hard Day's Night, because that's the middle of 1964, that's when everybody gets to see them on an enormous screen, just in absolute glorious black and white. What they provided was the notion of a surrogate family. Yeah, that everybody could join.
The brothers that you never had. Exactly. Exactly.
Absolutely. The idea that you could take your childhood relationships and you could take them out into the adult world, and you could be really admired for doing it, and you'd celebrate your own little peer group on a massive, massive scale. And I think that's what accounts for the fact that what happened with America and the Beatles is America just decided to fall in love. It's as simple as that. They decided, we're going to fall in love with these guys, and they did. And that's a love affair that's arguably gone on to this day. You know, it's more profound than just a successful musical act.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
they're absolutely taken to the nation's heart. So I think it was the groupness that was
That's what, because you
immensely
talk about all
powerful.
those bands, the Byrds and Tom Petty, Springsteen, Donald Fagen, all sorts of people are incredibly captivated by that. We probably haven't got time to do all of them, but there are so many interesting groups that after the second wave, as it were, after the Beatles, the others, you know, there's the story of the Day Clark. These aren't that well known, these stories. There's Day Clark Five, there's Herman's Hermits, and there's the Animals. Maybe you should pick one of those and talk about briefly about their trajectory, because they're incredible stories.
Dave Clark Five, talking to the second wave,
the first indie group, weren't they?
Dave Clark Five are effectively going to the United States just as the Beatles are coming back, you know, after 2 weeks. And so there's a massive appetite in the States for anything English. And Dave Clark Five's Glad All Over is a hit record in the United States. And, you know, the Dave Clark Five, for probably 2 years following that time, were almost as big in the United States as the Beatles were. You know, it didn't last. They didn't continue to have a legacy or anything like that. But there were many things about them that made them more appealing to the Americans than they were in Britain. I think one of the things is that they had a saxophone.
Yeah.
Very few English groups had a saxophone. Whereas Dave Clark Five always seemed to, you know, to be they easily adapted to that American frat house sound. You know, in Britain they learnt a lot of their trade playing US Air Force bases in East Anglia, and their big boast was they'd go along there on a Saturday and they'd hear something on the jukebox and they'd go away and they could learn it and play it for the following week. And they were very good. And they were the first, although nobody talks about it now, they were the first indie group, because the Beatles and all the other groups had just signed on to the record companies and in traditional fashion.
Dave Clark owned all the rights to them. In fact, he paid for the records to be made and then hired them out leased them to the record companies.
He was a film stuntman. He just knew his way about. They came from Tottenham. They were genuinely working class in a way that the Beatles really weren't, you know. Yeah. And they paid for making their first records, so they owned the masters. They were independently done. They were marketed as the Tottenham sound, you know, which never took at all.
Never quite took off.
But oddly enough, they were all made in an independent studio in Holland Park, long before independent studios were the big thing. And they had this very, very, well, Bruce Springsteen still calls it, they had a nasty sound. And, you know, Bits and Pieces, Glad All Over. These are things that still nowadays sound fantastic as run-out music at sporting events. You know, they're built for big scale.
They do, yeah.
And in the Dave Clark Five, you can hear
that kind of military beat to them.
You get traces of what emerged years later in Kiss and all these kind of acts. You know, so they were hugely important for the period of time. And then there were people like the Animals who never managed to make the graduation from a singles act to an albums act, because they couldn't really write their own songs and they were not terribly well managed. But if you look at the Animals, trail of singles, you know, Baby Let Me Take You Home, House of the Rising Sun, Don't Let Me Be Misunderstood, It's My Life, We Got to Get Out of This Place, Don't Bring Me Down. They're all written by Americans. They're all American material.
That's the irony, is because they're actually remaking American music, until like House of the Rising Sun, in fact, taking it back to America, which is extraordinary.
Doing it better.
Doing it better.
That's the really interesting thing about the Animals. On those singles, they were utterly inspired. And you go and listen to those records now, and they've got a crackle about them that you don't get everywhere. And again, somebody like Bruce Springsteen will tell you that if you want to know where the Promised Land came from, go and listen to Don't Let Me Be Misunderstood by the Animals, because it completely taken, you know. So they were immensely influential, even though they never.
Another strange dimension to it. You got this sort of a grumpy kind of Geordie presiding over the great psychedelic boom later on of Eric Burdon of the West Coast. But look, I was going to ask you about the Stones, because you make such a good point about the Stones. So what was it that was so revolutionary about what they wore on stage? I was fascinated by that.
Well, yeah. The people nowadays say, oh, the Rolling Stones never wore a uniform. Well, they did. Very early days. If you look at them, Andrew Eldon put them in houndstooth jackets and so forth, and they did do that stuff, but they abandoned it. And people remarked, particularly when they went to the United States, that when they went on stage at the Academy of Music in New York, they looked as if they just wandered in off the street. And that was something that nobody was used to seeing, because it was taken for granted that all musical entertainers, whether they're classical, pop, jazz, novelty, whatever, wore some kind of uniform that reflected their business. Whereas the Rolling Stones never did that. And so they all looked as if they just adopted their own thing. And this, I think, made them hugely magnetic as TV performers. Because TV, for the Rolling Stones, I think even more than the Beatles, TV was their medium. If you watch them on, the Tammy show or the...
And Jagger really played to the cameras.
Jagger plays
he didn't have an instrument to play, but he
plays to the tiny window that the camera gives him. So every song, every hit they had, he'd work out a piece of business. And those of us who remember, Satisfaction coming along in 1965, which was the thing that just took them to another level. The thing that he used to use to accompany Charlie's drum break was the slapping motion with the hand wiped back and forth as if issuing a challenge to a duel, which was imitated in playgrounds, the length and breadth of the world, really. But the interesting thing to me about Satisfaction, and I write about this quite a bit in the book, is Andrew Oldham has been at them to just write their own stuff, not just adapt R&B favorites, Little Red Rooster, Last Time, all those kind of things. You've got to write your own stuff. And so Satisfaction just occurs to them in the middle of a tour. They record it twice, first time unsuccessfully, second time successfully. And the thing about Satisfaction, 1965, unarguably the annus mirabilis of the 7-inch 45, absolutely no doubt about it. It's the year of Like a Rolling Stone, and great Beatles records and great Motown records and whatever. But probably, arguably, the best record of the year is Satisfaction. And it sounds, it's beyond sounding like an American record. It's a record about America. It's a record that completely reflects the experience of being in America. And from then on, that's what the Rolling Stones do. Get Off My Cloud, same thing. Have You Seen Your Mother, Baby? Honky Tonk Women, all these things.
They're become an American institution.
They've got to be,
It's interesting because the Beatles actually wrote songs that are mostly just fictions, and they're mostly stories about love affairs, and they're mostly dramas, but they weren't particularly about the outside world. But Satisfaction, they're talking about advertising, aren't they? They're talking about what's happening on American television. It's completely in touch with what's going on.
Can't be a man because he doesn't smoke the same cigarettes as
me.
All that kind of stuff. It's all about the kind of tacky impermanence of American life, which the British acts found simultaneously fascinating and depressing, and that goes all the way through the book. Is that the English, and it is mainly English here we're talking about.
Yeah,
their attitude to America, I think, still probably to this day, is that we can't decide whether to feel superior to it or inferior to it. We just can't quite work out. And that's what the Rolling Stones brilliantly reflect. That's going on absolutely all the way through their records, And that to me is one of the fascinating strands in this curious relationship between the two countries when it relates to popular music.
There's a bit where the pendulum swings back to the other way, and suddenly it's all about Britain in Britain. And, the Walker Brothers go there to kind of launch, and Jimi Hendrix goes there to launch. And Sonny and Cher go there trying to have a hit, as do the Byrds, And it's suddenly all about Britain. And there's just a fantastic point you make that Britain invents the guitar hero. Although it's not actually Britain, is it? I mean, it's more specific than Britain.
It's really, it's the suburbs of London, probably.
Yeah.
You could probably go even closer and say it's the southwestern suburbs of London.
Yeah.
Because we're talking about Eric Clapton, Jimmy Page, Jeff Beck, Peter Green, maybe you might extend it to Mick Taylor, So Chas Chandler brings Jimi Hendrix to London to launch him, because if you launch an American act in Britain at the time, they reappear in America with the fairy dust of swinging London all over them, which does them no end of good.
Yeah,
But also,
British endorsement, incredibly important
absolutely.
at that point, wasn't it?
And so, but also he brings them here because that's the home of the guitar hero. And he puts him on at various clubs in the West End, knowing that on any Saturday night he can get all of those guys will turn up to watch the new gun in town and to give him their blessing. So that is, that's developed out of London, out of England, and then it goes to America and it blows up into a huge new form of music. Because what happens to all these groups? And you talk about Eric Clapton, and you talk about with Cream and so forth. They go to America, and they suddenly find, and this is 1966, 67, they suddenly find they're playing a different kind of show in front of a different kind of audience.
Yeah, because they were in quite small clubs, little kind of dance parlors, weren't they? Now these are bigger audiences, and the audiences are sitting. And they're sitting down, aren't they? And
they're sitting down.
Yeah.
They're nodding rather seriously. That they are immensely appreciative of the musicianship involved.
Yeah.
And this, as you can imagine, goes absolute to the head of any young guitar hero from the UK who's used to having to deal with a bunch of blokes having a fight over there in the corner, and then some girls who really wish you'd play your hit, shuffling from side to side to some kind of dance. Whereas here you're playing for guys with hair as long as you, long as yours, who've probably taken more drugs than you have and appear to be on the level that you're on yourself. So this has a massive effect on British music. And so what happens is these acts go to America, and then they, in observing the audience and how the audience responds and what works in the market, they come back and refashion themselves for the American market. And this, the classic case of this is obviously Led Zeppelin, because Jimmy Page had been out there as a member of the Yardbirds, and Peter Grant had been out there, and yet Led Zeppelin were designed for the United States, and
also designed a kind of new kind of music that would travel long distances, wasn't it? It had to be about reaching the back of some drafty kind of arena rather than
it had to be broad. It was
halls,
not subtle.
University halls. Yeah,
there were loads of elements there. That when Jimmy Page first calls Terry Reid and asked him to be the singer of Led Zeppelin, and Terry Reid, dear man, dear sweet man, says, "No, I've got my own solo thing I'm doing."
Yeah, which I'm sure he doesn't regret, even to this day.
He doesn't actually. He's a very, very nice man, and he doesn't regret it at all. But he says, "I'll tell you what. There's a bloke called Robert Plant I've seen in a band in the Midlands," and Page says, "Is he good looking?" and Terry Reid says, "Why do you want to know that?" Yeah. And so in that question, you can see why Jimmy Page lives in a listed building in Holland.
Absolutely.
And Terry Reid doesn't. This was people getting more serious about the money making opportunities that were going on in the United States. And then at the same time, you've got the Who has started to arrive, and the Who was somewhat late to arrive in America for all kinds of complicated reasons. And if you look at the Who's 1967, it's absolutely hilarious picture of the range of stuff that people had to do in 1967. I think the first gig in that year, they play in at Morecambe Pavilion, I think, and they're playing alongside an organist and a group called the Doodlebugs. And then by the middle of the year, they're playing one-nighters in the States. By the middle of the year, they're playing the Monterey Festival. Then they go on tour supporting who? Herman's Hermits. Because Herman's Hermits, let's not forget,
we're a big deal.
Very big deal for a couple of years. And by the end of the year, they're doing the kind of great heavy rock extravaganza with Vanilla Fudge at the Long Beach Arena. That's an extraordinary journey. That's an extraordinary amount of distance to travel in a short period of time. But Pete Townsend always says that the Who learnt to play properly in the United States because people weren't screaming at them. People weren't asking for the new hit single because they hadn't really had hit singles. That wasn't what they were about. But they had an opportunity.
People were allowing them to develop and
to allow them to develop.
Yeah, yeah.
And he talks about we learned in what he calls the electric ballroom. And by that, he doesn't just mean one venue. It means a number of venues that, that lend themselves to bands just exploring their possibilities a lot more than they would have had the chance in the UK just doing the standard one-nighters. And also playing places like the Fillmore, which bothered to have decent sound and bothered to have decent lighting, and bothered to kind of please the paying customer and wanted the artist to enjoy it. And so he says, he pays a lot of tribute to the great Bill Graham, the American promoter, that he was the man who gave us dignity as artists. And that wouldn't have happened back in the UK.
No, wouldn't have completely different.
Because the live scene was not developed in that way in the UK, whereas it was in the US.
Yeah.
So that's how you get the kind of the transition into the massive world of stadium rock and heavy rock.
Yeah.
All those things. It comes out of those guitar heroes who went to the United States in 1966, 67.
So late 60s, I mean, a lot of us, certainly people like you and me, had this intensely romantic vision of American life based on, its movies and its geography and its folklore. Describe how the greatest example of cultural appropriation was going on in Pinner.
Well, it fascinates.
That's a great story, isn't it?
Well, by the end of the 60s, America's, I wouldn't say it's regained the initiative, but it's doing some interesting things. There are the Flying Burrito Brothers, obviously the band, Leon Russell, all these people are tapping in to the traditional values of American music. They're going back to the country, they're reaching back to roots. And you would have thought this is a direction in which no English act could, I'm going to have excuse me.
That's all right. Carry on.
Drink of water. Excuse me.
Yeah, it proves it's live.
I'm sorry about that. You would have thought it was impossible for any English act to follow in that way. But, the former Reg Dwight of Pinner, newly transformed into Elton John, and his songwriting buddy, Bernie Taupin from Spalding in Lincolnshire, living with his mother in Pinner and spending all their time in the import bins of Harlequin and One Stop and all these places in Soho, flicking through Leon Russell and Quicksilver Messenger Service on whatever is the new thing. They have a head so full of all this stuff that Bernie writes all these lyrics about, the ballad of a well-known gun. And they're all about returning from the Civil War and burn down the mission and all that kind of stuff. And
the cover of the record looks fabulously American.
I think I probably got it.
Probably got it there, yeah. But in fact, it was shot in a railway station somewhere in southern England, wasn't it?
It's shot in, this is Tumbleweed Connection, which is all about America.
Yeah. It's
written in Pinner. It's recorded in Wardour Street, and the cover was shot on the Bluebell Railway in Sussex.
That's right. It is, and neither of the two people responsible for writing it had ever been to America.
At that stage, they hadn't been.
No.
But it was a big breakthrough record for them when they they went later that year, and he had that remarkable entry at the Troubadour, which was a little bit like the Beatles' entry all those years earlier. In that it happened
literally overnight, didn't it? Yeah.
Well, he was presented as Dick James, the publisher, has published the Beatles, and now he's publishing Elton John. So, in that sense, he's kind of the heir to the Beatles. So he starts at the Troubadour. He's introduced by Neil Diamond. You know what I mean? That gives you an idea of how high a level he entered at. One of the years of struggle. Elton arrived, fabulous reviews, and his career just took off from then on.
There's a brilliant chapter also about David Bowie. He went on a kind of reconnaissance mission to the States in 1971, paid for, I think, taken over by Mercury Records, didn't he? Because he had the man who sold the world, and to promote. Now, why did that have such a profound effect on him? It completely changed his life.
I think so. He went off when his wife was, heavily pregnant with their first child and so forth. He had 2 to 3 weeks. I think the key to that trip, he goes in 1971, is he went on his own. Now, I don't know how you first went to America, but I went on my own. And if you go on your own,
I did too. Yeah.
You internalize this fantastic experience you have. It's like having a dream, but it's real life. Everything you look at, every sign you look at, every bit of speech you overhear, every menu item you read is profoundly kind of exciting and stimulating. And that was what happened with David Bowie. And so he went from one place to another in America and reinvented himself in between. And so the early bits, he's in New York. He's been shown around by Paul Nelson and people like that. And then he goes to Texas. He goes to the middle of the country. And then he goes to California. And he re-emerges in California a totally different person. Wearing these wacky hats. And
people in Britain are saying, they think of him as being kind of shy and self-contained, don't they? And apparently here's this garrulous, hilarious, highly entertaining, flamboyant character. They couldn't quite work out it was the same guy.
And during that trip, he hears, the Stooges and the Velvet Underground and all that sort of stuff. And during that trip, he has the idea he's going to have he's going to write some songs about somebody called Ziggy Stardust. And so, I think that fundamentally changes David Bowie. That experience of like 3 weeks on his own absolutely turns his head around in a way that it did for quite a lot of people.
Yeah.
And oddly enough, David Bowie didn't really have a big hit in America until 76, 77. And it wasn't until he made Fame, he made Young Americans. He made a record in America for America, as many people by then were learning to do, not least Rod Stewart. It wasn't until then that he really had a breakthrough in America. But his records like Diamond Dogs, Aladdin Sane, Ziggy Stardust, they're American all over them.
Yeah.
They're just, America's totally gone to his head in the best possible way. He's come back talking about sidewalks and other elevators, and writing songs in a totally different idiom. And I think that's where it changed for David Bowie.
Well, there's a really interesting section leaping forward a little bit to about punk rock and about punk rock's catastrophic failure to connect with America. And you talk about this Pistols tour, which is really interesting because they seem to be deliberately kind of self-sabotaging. They're playing parts of America that would kind of loathe them the most, But why was it that punk rock didn't connect with America? Because it was just not enthusiastic about the place.
You see, I think oddly enough, it did connect, but years later, because you can say that Kurt Cobain and Nirvana was punk rock many years after the event,
True, based on 1981 punk rock, wasn't it? Late 70s,
I think the problem was that it's very difficult to go to America unless you can happily say, we're pleased to be here. The Beatles were pleased to be here. The Rolling Stones were pleased to be here because it's where all our heroes come from. All that kind of stuff. It's standard politeness when you go to a foreign country to say you're pleased to be there. Very difficult for punk rock, particularly the Sex Pistols, to ever say they were pleased to be anywhere other than...
No, it was not being on brand, was it?
It wasn't being on brand.
No, not on message.
And so during that tour, which, as you say, was kind of deliberately booked in the southern states of America, because I think Malcolm McLaren thought he might be able to generate some friction between the Sex Pistols and redneck audiences that might give them the spark that they had in Britain. Didn't really work. And Johnny Rotten was on stage going to the audience, I'm not here to amuse you. You're here to amuse me. You can't say that to the Americans.
That doesn't go down very well.
It just doesn't wash.
They don't like that. For some reason, they don't like that.
And post-punk, this is the days of the NME and Sounds of Melody Maker, where there's massive amounts of new acts coming out of Britain absolutely all the time. We're constantly discovering the new thing, and they all go to America, and 99% of them fail because they can never work out how to manage that relationship. You got the ridiculous thing, the Boomtown Rats go. I know they're not British, but they come from the same culture. And, you can't go on stage in the States and introduce Rat Trap by saying, this is a better song than Bruce Springsteen could ever write. Nobody's going to take that as being hilariously tongue-in-cheek.
Did you run that past the management first? I don't think you did.
It's not going to work at all. No. And so hundreds of British acts who went to America in the years afterwards couldn't work out how to do that. And again, it comes back to this business. Can't decide whether to look down on them or look up, because actually the act from, I think, we can call it the British Isles, that really inherited the mantle was U2.
U2, completely.
Who come from a very similar culture, but obviously they're not British. And the Americans absolutely adopt them because they're Irish, and all Americans think they're Irish. And Bono and U2 brilliantly know how to be diplomatic.
Yeah,
they know how to kind of tickle America where America.
And they know exactly how to play into what America wants, exactly,
really
rather than just superimposing something on, hoping they like it.
Absolutely.
There's the fascinating bit about the kind of third wave, the third kind of American invasion, which at one point I think it's in 1983 sees 18 British acts in the top 40. This is Soft Cell, Culture Club, The Police, Human League, Eurythmics, groups like that. Now, basically one thing was responsible for that, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's basically MTV.
Yeah.
MTV starts, and when it started, very few in America thought it was going to work. They just thought, why would anybody want videos around the clock? And because it went on to be an absolute phenomenon. In its very early days, they had MTV, they had the airwaves, but they had very little product to use.
Because no American groups, because we all had stuff ready for Top of the Pops, didn't we?
So we had stuff, every British band, because it's a singles market in Britain, certainly was at that time, every British band shot a video for every single, pretty much, because they'd go on Saturday morning telly, or they wanted to be on Top of the Pops, all those kind of outlets. So there were 1,000,001 clips lying around in British record companies of kind of, the problem was at the time, American acts all looked like truck drivers, and English acts happily looked like hairdressers. And so, post MTV, hairdressers is what you want. Bring them in. Yeah. I think in the case of the Flock of Seagulls, they literally were all hairdressers.
I think some of them were hairdressers. That's right.
And all these
Mike Score did a bit of home experimenting. I think probably. Yeah.
All these acts were marked out by the fact that that they had these really eccentric hairdos and looks, and and they wore makeup and all these kind of things. So that's what really brought them to the attention of the American public. And so you get this second wave, which at the time was embraced, and I suppose spearheaded by Culture Club and Annie Lennox, Eurythmics, Duran Duran, Soft Cell, all those kind of things coming afterwards. And then
a lot of people found it surprising that groups like Culture Club could be so widely accepted in America.
Yes.
Did that surprise you? I mean, you think of the American taste generally.
Well, they were all. I think there were girls. There were loads of girls who really liked Culture Club, and I think what's happening, they were kind of flexing their muscles at the time. It was never difficult in America to scare up a fundamentalist preacher who can tell you that Boy George is leading the youth of America into hell. That's always gone on.
Quadruples the record sales overnight.
It wasn't really a problem, and but none of those groups really made the transition into absolute major permanent fixtures of the American scene. Because if you go right back to the beginning, that's the interesting thing to me about the whole area is that the whole British rock music, pop music experiment is predicated on the basis that if it does really well, you'll make it in America. And therefore, it's worth really big bets to make it in America. Because if you make it in America, the arithmetic totally changes. If you have a middling hit, it sells enough to buy you a huge house, And so everything became about America, about continuing to make it in America. And as you said earlier, the 1983 point, I think it's 18 out of the top 40.
Yeah, 18 out of top 40.
The top 40 are of British derivation, whether that's the Police, who were obviously really big at the time, things like Eddie Grant, there's the Pretenders, there's the Kinks, there's all kinds of people. Because what's also starting to happen there is the beginnings of dance culture. And what loads of those groups provided was really good pop tunes you could dance to.
Yeah.
That's what made them popular in Britain, equally made them popular in the United States.
And that sort of led to the next wave of America retaking the lead, because a lot of that's based around Madonna, I think. Madonna's sudden success as a kind of pop dance kind of item. And suddenly America was kind of on the front foot again. And America produced loads of A, girl pop stars, and B, solo acts. Bruce Springsteen, Prince.
That's
Jackson,
that's the obvious contrast. If you look at the biggest British acts are Beatles, Stones, Led Zeppelin, those kind of things. They're groups. The biggest American acts, Elvis Presley, Bruce Springsteen, Madonna, Michael Jackson, they tend to be solos.
Yeah.
It's an individualist culture. So that's what people respond to. And of course, by the mid 80s, they were bringing it all here. And so, I interviewed Bruce Springsteen at the beginning of that tour, Born in the USA tour in the States. And it was certainly felt in Britain at the time that you could never make somebody like Bruce Springsteen a really big star in the UK, because he was too specifically American. Well, that was proven wrong within about 6 months.
Yeah.
And you had hundreds of thousands of people going to Wembley wearing massive cowboy hats and Stars and Stripes bandanas and, doing their best to look and act as archetypally American as they possibly could in a way that hadn't really happened before. And so, the big acts of the 80s are Madonna, Prince, Michael Jackson, and Bruce Springsteen. And they're all individuals, and they all, if you scratch, they sing about America. They're about America, They've probably written songs about America,
Somewhere you say also that the Bruce Springsteen, the idea that he kind of pulled himself out of his group and called the group Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band, and wanted to be referred to as the boss, is something that could only have happened in American culture. It wouldn't have happened in British culture, because nobody would have allowed that to happen.
No,
the idea of bosses.
We accept that there are bosses, but we don't like talking.
We don't like to applaud them.
Britain's. I think it's very interesting that we're obviously very. Are we any more hierarchical than anybody? Well, we're certainly very socially conscious.
Yeah.
But also we have a rich tradition of kind of cheek and insubordination, which I think animates the best British music all through the years. The British pop stars aren't afraid of saying things. It might get them into trouble from time to time, but they'll say them. American acts, they tend to play safe. They're aware of the big picture all the time,
Yeah.
So that couldn't go on forever.
So you finished the book, I think, in February, and lots happened since then. So do you feel that things have changed in terms of the Anglo-American relationship?
It hasn't changed anything in terms of the book, because the book.
No, not remotely.
1964 to 1983. But no, it's interesting that I handed the book in February, and then in early March this all happened. And I was just thinking about this today, that the early part of the book, 1961, 62, whatever, America is very, very far away, geographically and culturally, from Britain. None of us imagine ever. The average Briton never imagined going there ever. It was just a dream. And if you take the situation now, I don't pretend to know how long this current unpleasantness will go on, but it's not going to solve itself quickly. It's not going to go back exactly to where it was. And so, we will emerge from it with the distance between Britain and America, culturally and geographically, probably like it was in 1962. It'll be a long way away for most people. And the acts who go there will be the dead certs who go there. They won't necessarily be the thousands who traveled with hope in their hearts and a commotion in their trousers, desperately just believing if I could only get to play at the Fillmore East, or if I could only get interviewed by Rolling Stone, I would join the company of the elect. Because that was the great dream that drove British bands from the 60s through to the 90s. I don't think that's coming back in a hurry.
No, it's not. And if you want to revisit them, which you should, Dave's book is absolutely brilliant and a fantastic escape from current circs, and and I could not recommend it more highly. Fantastic! Thank you very much for watching, for attending, and thank you, Dave, enormously. And the book is out on, I think, Thursday the 17th, and available from all standard physical and digital vendors. And people should get in there and acquire a copy as soon as possible.
And your name is? And on that note,
see you soon.